Programmet, du skal til at se, er finansieret af Kontrasts medlemmer. Hvis du kan lide, hvad du ser, så meld dig ind på kontrast.dk.
Så velkommen til dagens medlemsarrangement med Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Mit navn det er Mikkel Andersen, og jeg er chefredaktør for Kontrast, og i dag der er jeg også interviewer. For efter en kort introduktion her, så vil jeg interviewe Ayaan Hirsi Ali i cirka en halv times tid, hvorefter vi har omtrent 20-25 minutter til spørgsmål, som I meget gerne må forberede allerede nu. De kan skrives i chatten her i Zoom ude til højre, eller også så kan I række hånden op via Zooms funktion til det. Og så vil min assistent Sabine, hun vil vælge nogle stykker efterfølgende. Jeg kan ikke garantere, at vi kan nå alle, nu må vi se, så derfor så vil jeg bede jer om at formulere jeres spørgsmål så kort og koncis som muligt, og gerne undgå lange enetaler med jeres egne synspunkter, uanset hvor fantastisk jeg er sikker på, at de allerede er. Og så vil jeg lige sige, lad os komme i gang herfra. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, hun er prisbelønnet menneskerettighedsforkæmper og en fremtrædende debattør. Så er hun forfatter til bestsellerne Jeg anklager, Ayaan og Nomaden. Og så er hun født i Somalia, opdraget som muslim. Hun voksede op i Afrika og i Saudi-Arabien, og så flygtede hun til Holland i 1992, hvor hun gik fra at gøre rent på fabrikker og til at blive valgt ind i det hollandske parlament i 2003. Hun har levet et liv under beskyttelse, siden hun skrev manuskriptet til kortfilmen Submission, der som bekendt kostede instruktøren Theo van Gogh livet. Efterfølgende så har hun etableret The AHA Foundation, der blandt andet bekæmper omskæring, tvangsægteskaber og æresdrab. Siden 2006 der har hun boet i USA, hvor hun nu er Research Fellow på The Hoover Institution ved Stanford University. Ayaan Hirsi Alis nyeste bog, Frit bytte, på engelsk Pray, den er netop udkommet på dansk på Politikens forlag, og det er den, vi i dag primært tager afsæt i. So, welcome to you, Mrs. Ali, and thank you very much for joining us and taking the time to speak with us today. First of all, I would like to, if you could briefly introduce your book and tell us a bit about what prompted you to write this book, Pray.
Well, Mikkel, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and also thank you very much for having me on your platform. I have been a long time admirer of Denmark, and especially the Danish approach to Islam and Europe and integration. My book, Pray, the name tells you everything. It's about women and the public space in Europe. The public space in some neighborhoods, in some countries, has become less safe for women because of men who come from countries where the attitude towards women is one of contempt. Most of these men come from Muslim majority countries. I make it very clear in the book that this is not a story about all Muslim men. There are a lot of Muslim men who are very, very respectful towards women. And there are a lot of Muslim men who have come to different European countries and who have assimilated successfully. So this is not a book to malign Muslim men or Muslim communities. It's simply a book that draws attention to a specific problem. And that problem is women's safety. And when I say women, it's not a specific type of woman. It's all kinds of women. In the book, I tell stories of children as young as 11 years old who have been assaulted, but also women in their 70s. Some of the women are white, most of them are white. But if a woman of color, or even a woman who is wearing the hijab, walks in some of these neighborhoods, she's bound to get into trouble. So that is first and foremost the subject of the book. This is because of immigration. In later years, such as the influx of 2015, but the problem I discuss in Pray, it predates this most recent immigration. It's been going on for a long time. It's been going on for decades. And some countries have taken steps to recognize that there is a problem and to do something about it. they're having the conversations about it and what to do about it, like Denmark, but also like Austria. Most recently in France, because of Samuel Paty, the teacher who was beheaded for trying to show cartoons in a classroom where he was trying to explain the freedom of expression. Because of that, in France, again, the conversation on the subject of Islam in general and a particular type of Muslim behavior, that debate is now wide open. In fact, there is a bill in the lower house. It has passed the lower house. It is now in the Senate, and it's about to be passed, and it is on the separatism, Islamist separatism in France. But there are many countries where it's still very, very difficult to talk about this subject. And anybody who raises any kind of issue with immigration from Muslim majority countries or the value clash between Islamist values and European values, anybody who tries to open that conversation is accused of being xenophobic, of being racist, of trying to impose Eurocentric notions on Muslim immigrants. And so it's still in parts of Europe very, very difficult to have this conversation. But I'm glad you are in Denmark. And in Denmark, it seems, I don't speak Danish, but from what my Danish friends tell me, it seems as if at least there is no problem with having the conversation, which is the first step towards finding a resolution.
Yes, one of the topics that you brought in your book, Pray, is this lack of defense coming from the feminist and the leftist, typical people who are typically quite critical towards organized religion and the misogyny which is espoused from those quarters. Of course, it's covered at length in your book. Could you try to explain why there has seemed to be this lack of willingness to tackle what, for many commentators, seems to be a rather obvious problem?
Well, I have heard so many different reasons, and I tried to chronicle these reasons in my book. But the usual, most common reasons, number one, it's fear. People are afraid to discuss anything that has to do with Islam because of the violence that may be used against them. And I've seen a lot of people say, in closed doors, behind closed doors, not in public, they will point to the problem and they'll say, this is exactly why we need to have a discussion. Here's why Islam is different from Western culture or Danish culture. But those people don't want to come out and talk about it in the open because they're afraid that what happened to Samuel Paty is going to happen to them. So just pure naked fear. A second reason is obviously the reason which happens very, very often these days is people being called racist and bigoted and xenophobic. And people don't want to be called these names. And they think, I see the problem, but it is for somebody else to take care of it. And a third reason, especially with feminists who have adopted and embraced the woke culture, is that they don't see immigrant men as the number one oppressors. They see immigrant men as victims themselves. So in the woke ideology, the uber oppressor is the white heterosexual man. And so if he sets one step wrong, they go after him. So sexual violence committed by white heterosexual men, it is condemned in every corner of feminism. When it comes to immigrant men, there's a hesitancy. Even the feminists themselves are afraid of being described as racist and heartless and anti-immigrant and so on. And then for other feminists, I think it's a class issue. They don't really experience the problems that I describe in the book because those problems take place in working class neighborhoods. The women who could afford to move away to safer neighborhoods, they have done that already. So for a lot of feminists who discuss and prioritize the shattering of the glass ceiling, having women CEOs, having women on the boards of large corporations, women in leadership positions. Those feminists, they don't see the subject of prey, which is the safety of women in the public space. They don't see that as a priority. For them, they feel safe, they are safe, they live in safe neighborhoods, their workplace is safe. So they don't have any kind of affinity with the working class women who have to fight, to fight off this unwanted male attention that is coming at them all the time. I mean, when it comes to politicians, in some countries, if you discuss openly the clash between Islamist and Islamic values with Western values, you tend not to win elections. So, for instance, I've experienced this when I was in Holland. We have the 4 large cities, that's Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht. A substantial minority of the residents, of the voters there, are Muslim themselves. And so a lot of politicians feel that if they discuss these problems, they will alienate those voters. And so they try not to talk about it. You see the same phenomenon in the United Kingdom. You see the same phenomenon in parts of France. For instance, the mayor of Paris, a few years she declared, oh, we have no go zones. Islam is all peace and wonderful. And if you try to analyze the logic behind statements like that, that is about elections and voting. So there are so many different reasons why people decide not to address the issue. But when you combine them all, it leads, unfortunately, to these taboos. We get more immigrants, we get more problems. The space for women, the public space for more and more women gets unsafe. And it's again, I repeat, it's unfortunate, but now the problem is big enough, large enough. And so we're in a place where we can't avoid discussing it.
One of the things that reading your book made me think about was this embrace that of certain parts of Islam that you see within what we could call woke culture. You see this embrace of the Islamic veil. You see that this is seen as a statement of progressivity and embracement of multiculturalism. I mean, that must be a very strange sensation for you to observe that the so-called tolerant left seems to not only tolerate, which has been what you've been talking about mostly until now, but also embrace some of the parts of what would be called Islamism or the more fundamentalist statements of Muslim culture?
Yes, there is this curious alliance between Islamists with an agenda and the radical woke left who also have an agenda. And one of the reasons why there is such an alliance is because their agendas overlap. The Islamist agenda is to replace, Western values and institutions with Islamist values, and they want to dominate in those institutions. And the same goes for the woke, far left woke people who say the existing structures are systemically racist and systemically sexist. And so the only way to reform and to bring about justice is to bring down these structures. That is why they like bringing down statues and other symbols of Western dominance. They also would like to erase the history of Western society or tell it in a different way, selectively, talking only about what went wrong, like the slavery and the colonization of others and the Holocaust. So the woke left like to talk about that. The Islamists like to talk about that. Another, I would say, common ground that they have, the Islamists and the woke, is their hostility to free speech. Both groups would like to silence peoples and groups that they don't agree with or who don't agree with them, instead of having a debate and letting the audience decide what makes sense to them. They want to silence. everyone. The woke through canceling people, and the Islamists literally by threatening to silence them with violence, and sometimes doing it, as in the case of Samuel Paty and Charlie Hebdo and Theo van Gogh, who worked with me. And I mean, I don't have to explain to the Danish community anything about the cartoons of 2006. So there are all of these things that I think overlap when it comes to the woke agenda and the Islamist agenda. But it's interesting in a way because there are things that they don't agree on, or you would think that would make them confront one another. For instance, the place of women, homosexuals, the whole transgender activism and advocacy. These are issues that I know that radical Islamists see differently. They see women as subordinates to men. They should stay at home and cover themselves. The woke, when they are serious about fighting for the rights of women, they fight for extreme equality between men and women. Homosexuality is to be punished with death in many of the countries that have Sharia law or Islamic law. And the Islamists truly believe in this. They think that being a homosexual is an aberration, an abomination, a sin against God, and it has to be punished with death, but it has to be punished. And then when it comes to the transgender groups, I don't think the Islamists have even recognized the existence of a phenomenon such as transgender, whereas it's a very big deal for the woke people. So it's interesting to see how, even though they find themselves as alliances on a number of issues, it would be interesting to see how they come together, or how they can avoid some of these issues. So it's really interesting. And it would be up to us probably to push both groups into having a discussion about the position of women or the position of gays, and so on.
When I think about this alliance between Islamists and the left, the example that comes to mind, I think, is what happened in Iran, where they had this idea that there could be an alliance between the two parties, and that ended pretty poorly for the leftists. I think it's, in hindsight, it's pretty safe to say. But do you think that the radical Islamists have any idea? Are they using these tendencies, post-colonialism, and the more anti-racist parts of the woke left in a kind of intentional way, or is it just a confluation of interest?
With the organized Islamists, so when I talk about organized, I'm talking about groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, any of those organized groups, Islamist groups, some of them oriented only towards deploying non-violent means to achieve their objectives, and some of them even jihadi, like the ISIS that were just dismantled and Al-Qaeda that were dismantled. They are open absolutely to exploiting the left, the far left, and the opportunities that the far left give them. You've seen this, as you described, in Iran, but we've also seen it in Egypt recently, when in 2011, Mubarak was brought down, and Mohammed al-Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, was actually elected president. When the Islamists come to power, they have no mercy at all for the leftists, but they do use the left and the ideology of the left to exploit and get, they've invented this word Islamophobia, for instance. That is the exploitation of an opening that's created by the far left. And you're absolutely right. When it comes to, when they have defeated everyone else and the ground is left only to the leftists and the Islamists win because they treat the leftists as infidels, as unbelievers, and ready to be killed, imprisoned, exiled, you name it. So for the moment, the description of the useful idiot applies to those on the left who think that the Islamists are their friends. To the Islamists, they are useful idiots.
In your book, you have a chapter devoted to what I think, I've read the Danish edition, but I think retranslated into English, I think it would be the failure of the integration industry, where you talk about how these enormous amounts of money which have been spent on promoting and facilitating into integration in the West and Western Europe especially, and not at least Denmark. We have a lot of these integration programs, which where you describe that they have been a failure, and they also seem to be doomed to failure intrinsically. Could you try to elaborate a bit on why that is your view?
Yes, the industry, it has become an industry that take taxpayer money and establish businesses where they say to the government, if you pay us, we're going to help integrate the immigrants, but they don't. And you can tell when a company or a business that says they're going to integrate people is going to fail and is just taking the money from the government, because they avoid the sensitive issues that are about integration. If you were to go out right now and start testing all of these organizations that take money from governments, and you ask them about the values, where are the programs or the curriculums with the sets of values that they are going to teach or introduce to the people that they're supposedly integrating, you won't see them, because that's exactly what they avoid. And so some of them will obviously offer language classes, which is fine, but language is only step number one. It's not really a full-blown integration. It doesn't solve that problem. But there are the Islamic or Muslim value system is radically different from that of the West. If you have just arrived from Iran, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Eritrea, Senegal, it doesn't matter where, but if you come from any of those countries, and you come into countries like Denmark and other European countries, your value system is very, very different. So if you look at some of these so-called integration organizations, which one of them is really offering these values? Which one of them is saying, here's the attitude towards women here is different from where you come from. The attitude towards Jewish communities is different from where you come from. Attitude toward homosexuality, attitude towards even such basic things as the nation state. If I were to put together an integration curriculum, I would know exactly what points I would put in there. I would put in something about the welfare state. You know, you go and get your welfare every month or every week, your welfare allowance, but where does that money come from? Should we be teaching immigrants things like that? Should we be teaching them about their new country and what it means to be a citizen of Denmark? And what I have noticed with the so-called integration organizations is they don't do any of that. They do the opposite. They say you can integrate while still holding on to your culture and your values. And that is the game that they've been playing with the government, because in the philosophy of multiculturalism, this sounds very good. It sounds so embracing and inclusive to say you can integrate and still hold on to your culture and your values, which is a lie. But that is how it's sold to the immigrant and to the government. And so it is an industry. And if these problems get solved, if people actually integrate, there will be no need for these to pay these businesses, and they will go out of business. And so they do everything possible to stay in business, which is to try and make the problem even bigger instead of shrinking it. I think it's that integration industry that upsets me the most, because I think it is absolutely possible for people to adapt and to adjust and to be absorbed into Danish society, Austrian society, German society, Dutch society. I've done it myself. And I think it is very easy to put together a program and offer it to people who come in or who even have been there for years that can lead to success. But some of the programs I've seen are just, they're distressing to say the least.
There seems to be kind of a certain naivete about this, the issue of culture. A couple of months ago, I interviewed Mr. Ruud Koopmans of the University in Berlin. He's a leading sociologist and immigration researcher, and he recently published a book which is translated into English. It will be something like the rotten foundations of Islam, where he looks at the performance of Muslim countries as compared to several other countries in regard to education, literacy, treatment of women, etc. And your own book paints a strikingly similar picture, that there seems to be something within Islamic culture, as broadly defined, of course, and recognizing that there, of course, are a lot of Muslims which are perfectly well integrated and functioning, but there seems to be something culturally at the heart of Islam which is dysfunctional, or at least, that's politely speaking, not very compatible with Western civilization, which should be, I mean, after these 40, 50 years of asylum, of immigration into the Western countries from Muslim countries, it should be obvious. Why isn't it?
Yes, so Ruud Koopmans' book is called The Crumbling House of Islam.
Oh, yeah.
And he does exactly what you describe, which is he first looks at the countries themselves. And he concludes that the integration problems that we see among Muslim minorities in Western countries are reflected in a much larger way in the countries of origin. And yes, exactly. He looks at all the variables that you have recounted of freedom, the treatment of women, income, or rather their economies then. And on all of these different levels, let's say, of modernity, the countries underperform. So if you compare two countries like Malaysia and South Korea is ahead in all of these variables, and Malaysia is behind. Why is that? Why are countries with large populations and a ton of natural resources still lagging behind? And it is inescapable. And I think by now, most people who have been watching the Islamic world and who have been watching Muslim communities in Western countries, by now you are absolutely right. They should see that there is a cultural element and that Islam is the big pink elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. If you adhere to the value system that is Islam, you are going to remain behind in all of these areas. You will have a freedom deficit, you will have a knowledge deficit, you will have a women's rights issue, you will have a human rights issue. The economies are not going to thrive. I mean, aside from these countries that have a lot of oil, and even those countries now are faced with the problems some of them see if they didn't have oil. You can see that countries like the UAE have diversified away from oil just in time. But even with countries like that, it's not their own populations that have been made ready to take the economy. They are importing people from outside to, to turbocharge their own economy. So Ruud Koopmans is right. And it's not just Ruud Koopmans, but anybody who has been looking very closely at Muslim countries and also looking at Muslim minorities in Western countries is going to see the same picture.
When we look at the topic of the treatment of women, I think that in regards to the events on New Year's Eve a couple of years ago in Cologne, where there was this, a lot of Muslim immigrants were mistreating women and groping them. This is described in your book as this phenomenon which is known as Tarahush Gamea, if I pronounce it correctly, and which I think. Okay, sorry, my pronunciation is probably way off. But I think that many ideas ascribe such behavior to some kind of malintegration. But in your book, you quite convincingly says that that is not so. That is actually a phenomenon which has been prevalent in Muslim countries and has been described there for many years. Can you try to elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, it is this phenomenon indeed. And men will circle, they will form three circles, an inner circle that is around a woman. So three circles around the prey, the woman that they hunt down and circle. And the inner circle will be raping her with their fingers and literally just abusing this woman. Too difficult to describe here. But if you want to hear a very detailed description of exactly what happens to the woman, please watch the interview with Lara Logan, the journalist for CBS News who was covering the Arab Spring protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo. So I would like your viewers and the people who are listening, the audience who are listening to us today, if they really want to know exactly what happens to the woman, they should watch that interview. But they form three circles, and one circle is attacking the woman. The other circle, the second circle, is cheering and encouraging the attack and inciting. And then the outer circle, the larger one on the outside, is making sure that people on the general public do not see and do not interfere with the attack. And taharrush, it's called the rape game, and Gami'a means collectively. They're doing this as a collective. It's not always, in fact, it's rarely organized, which makes it interesting. It can happen spontaneously, young men making eye contact, a woman who finds herself in a very vulnerable position where she's walking alone, for instance, and then suddenly this thing happens. And this happens in Algeria, it happens in so many different Muslim majority countries. And the victim is usually blamed by her family. If she survives an attack like that, is usually blamed by everyone because everyone says, why are you doing there? Why were you out there? You shouldn't be in a place where you can be attacked that way. But again, a huge difficulty usually is identifying who exactly is responsible for the attack because it happens in this big group. And that is what happened in Cologne, that the authorities were almost incapable of identifying anyone. There were so many, about 600 women went and talked to the police, but the convictions were very small because it was incredibly difficult to get any of the perpetrators to be prosecuted and come to trial. That phenomenon is new in Europe. And I know that Silvesternacht, the Cologne incident, got a lot of publicity, but there were other attempts in Sweden at the concerts and other places. So it's hopefully it's now something that the authorities in European countries know about and should make sure that no such thing happens in Europe.
I think we'll take a couple of questions now. I think I've been interviewing you for about half an hour now. I think we'll start with Lasse Birk Olsen. He's also one of the owners of our medium, so I have to kind of prioritize him in the order of the questions. Lasse, what is your question?
Hi, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I read somewhere that you were commenting on the degree to which it's something in Islam that is responsible for these things. And I think a counter argument to that would be that, it might be that the Quran has some unfortunate or nasty passages, but so does the Old Testament with the stoning of women or whatnot. What makes you think that Islam and the Quran seems to be causing more of this than it seems to be that Christianity is?
I think the most glaring difference is the separation of church and state, or religion from politics. If you look at most countries with Christian majorities, they have governments that are secular. So the Old Testament is not used as a guidance to govern people. People may be Christian believers, they may go to church and they may believe in these things. And some Christians actually do have beliefs that are hostile to women, to homosexuals, but they're not allowed to act on that by the secular government, because laws and rules are made by the secular government. Whereas what you see in Muslim majority countries is that some of them have open Sharia law. So basically the laws are inspired and they come from the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. So countries like that are Saudi Arabia, they are Iran. Borneo apparently decided to adopt Sharia law. And then in some countries, Sharia law or Islamic law is applied in certain regions. So they're like Indonesia. Indonesia is formally a secular country or a country with a secular government. But in some of its regions, they've allowed Sharia law to be applied. The same thing goes for a country like Nigeria, which is officially, it is a country with a secular government. But in some of the regions, they have allowed for Islamic law to be applied. And then there are countries that supposedly have secular governments. They do secular dictatorships. But when it comes to family law, and family law governs the relationship between men and women, it governs marriage, it governs divorce, it governs child custody. In so many Muslim majority countries, on an informal level, that family law is Sharia law. It's derived from Sharia law. So you don't have any Christian countries that are like that. And so that, I would say, is the most important difference. There are other differences, but we don't have enough time, but that's the most important difference.
We have a question submitted in writing from Anas Oris. He says, first of all, thank you for being here. I can appreciate that one. But one obvious counter-argument would be that you are identifying towards what you're saying, would be to say that you are identifying Islam as a monocausal, a singular cause of all the problems that you're describing, and that would be wrong. What would your response be to that?
Well, my response to that is, I'm not saying in any of my books, by the way, not just this book, Pray, but all the others, I'm not saying that Islam is the only cause of any of the problems that we're talking about. But Islam is, in some case, for instance, the attitude to women, it is the main cause. So for instance, if you come, if you are to live in a Muslim majority country, you would very quickly learn about modesty. I call it the modesty doctrine. That modesty doctrine is derived from the Quran. And that modesty doctrine dictates that there are good women and there are bad women. There are those who are virtuous, those who are not. There are those who are chaste and those who are not. So if you are considered modest, then you have a male guardian, which is your father or your husband or any other male relative, if those two are not available, that you have to cover yourself and dress modestly, lower your gaze, that you should be out and about outside of your house, chaperoned or protected by members of your government, members of your family, that your freedom of movement is constrained, your freedom of what you wear and what you can't wear is constrained, and all of that is derived from Islam. So that's a big cause. When men behave badly towards women, for instance, in Taharrush Gami'a, the rape game that we were just talking about, that's not in the Quran. That's not in the Hadith. The Prophet never said that men should engage in the rape game. But because it says that there are modest women and immodest women, if these men look at a woman on the street and they think of her as violating Islamic rules, then she's prey. she's up for grabs. You can hunt her down. So that is, it's not to be monocausal or to describe Islam as monocausal, but to give its place in why it is a major variable. If you were to change the attitudes of men towards women, if you were to get rid of the modesty doctrine, if you were to teach men to control their sexual desires, and by doing so, you give women more freedoms, you will be accused of being anti-Islamic and heretic and a bad person by Muslims. So there is, it's very important to be precise and to point out exactly what causes what and where the correlations are and what other kind of supporting factors there are. But I think it's also very, very important when you have something as big as the effect that Islamic teachings have on the relationship between men and women, to point that out and try to change it. And that's the hardest thing. And maybe, Mikhail, that's the reason why a lot of people try to avoid the subject of religion, because it's easier for them to understand these other factors because they're familiar. So people talk about poverty and they think if you educate a young man and he has a job, then there's less likelihood that he will molest women. That is true up to a point.
One of the things which you actually describe, which is quite interesting, that you identify as maybe a contributing factor to this particular view of women is the issue of polygamy, historical polygamy within many Islamic countries. And that was a connection. I hadn't pondered that before I read your book. Could you elaborate just a bit on that?
Yes, polygamy is very, very interesting. It predated Islam. So polygamy existed before Islam was founded, and polygamy exists in societies that are not Muslim. So that's one thing you could say, maybe you shouldn't, tie it to Islam. But most of the immigrants that come to Europe come from Muslim majority countries that also practice polygamy. Now, one issue that two scholars that I describe in the book have done is that they looked into the origins of polygamy and the consequences of polygamy. And what they find is that in any society that has polygamy, violence tends to be very high. Because they say you have young men in that military age category between the ages of 15 to about 35 years old who find themselves without women because the wealthier men hoard the women, and women are seen as a commodity. So a rich man will have 1, 2, 3, 4 or more wives. In Islam, it's limited to only 4 wives. But in any case, when rich men can hoard all the women for themselves, there are a lot of young, poor women, a lot of young, poor men who are left without women. And those men who are left without women, they tend to organize themselves and then to go ahead and try and kidnap women. That's a cause of violence because they can't afford the bride price. They can't afford basically to buy a woman. And they've seen this in societies that are Muslim. They've seen this in societies that are not Muslim. So this is the consequences of polygamy. And if then polygamous societies are more violent, that means there's more instability. It also means that there's more poverty. And so you have this vicious cycle that goes round and round and round, where they can't get out of poor economies because the economies are never stable enough. There isn't enough stability to grow anything. So that's one factor. And then a lot of the proponents of polygamy in Islamic society, they say, but we limit it to 4 wives. Islam says that you have to treat every wife absolutely equally. In practice, it's not how it happens. Even when you limit it to 4 wives, there's still men who are deprived of women. And even when you say treat them equally, husbands seem to have a favorite wife. And that then has a psychological impact on children that are born to the wives that are not favorites, and a whole, the psychological, emotional makeup of a society with polygamy is one of fear and suspicion and resentment, lying and cheating. And so polygamy has, I would say, very little benefits compared to all the bad consequences that it actually brings about.
We have a question from Regge, who asks that the term racism seems to have, and this is, I'm rephrasing slightly, that it seems to have deviated from its original idea that anyone could be hostile and prejudiced towards people based on their skin color, towards this more woke definition where it seems to be privilege plus power, which equates to a setting where it's only possible for white people to be racist. Is there any way to reclaim this term once again and actually reinstate it to its original meaning?
Yes, I think the best way to do is to make explicit this ideology. First of all, it is an ideology. It's pseudo-religious. I'm talking about the woke ideology, right? It goes by the name of critical theory, critical race theory, or critical justice theory. And you're absolutely right. The way they describe racism is not the way most of us understand racism. In fact, they say it's not even, it doesn't even have to do with skin color. Now it has only to do with policies and power structures. That's not how most of us understand race or racism or racial prejudice. So the way to reclaim it is to expose this ideology and especially expose their objectives. Once you wade through their descriptions of injustice and they give you all statistics about inequality and you go through all of that and you reach the point where you ask them, okay, what should we do about it? That's when it starts to get interesting, because that's when they say we have to bring down the institutions and the structures and the laws and everything that we have, because all of that is laced with racism and with injustice. So basically they're saying destroy everything. They're also saying that they want wealth to be redistributed. And they use words like reparations and all sorts of taking away from the rich and giving to the poor. So in many ways, it's really Marxism dressed up as something new and something postmodern. What I also find frightening about the woke ideology, which should be exposed, is the kind of racism that they promote against white people, especially white men. So it's now become acceptable in those circles to call for the killing of white men or to exclude people from gatherings based on their skin color. We have a university here called Evergreen University, which is in Washington State, and a biology professor was told not to attend a gathering. The woke people in that university were holding a gathering which they said is only for people of color, no white people allowed. I mean, just think about that. That is just in your face racism. It's ostentatious racism. And this biology teacher, who's of Jewish origin, said, I'm going to teach that day. And he got into trouble and the whole thing exploded, and that led to him leaving the university. But that's what's going on in our country. And I hope that it doesn't make its way to Europe and to Denmark. But the best way to fight this ideology is really to expose its incredibly destructive and sick mindset. That's what it is. It's really sick.
Marie Bjørn, she asks the question that in a couple of days there will be post this question to the Danish Minister of Education as to whether it would be possible to show or it should be mandatory to show the Mohammed cartoons in educational settings in the Danish elementary schools. This is, of course, after the killing of Paty in France. This is a quite touchy issue because there is it has been shown at least some risk associated with it. What would be your advice to the Danish teachers and the Danish government in this regard? Should it be mandatory?
I said this in 2006 when I came to Denmark. I said it in Holland when Theo van Gogh was murdered for his opinion and because of Submission, the film we made together. I said we have to make it very clear to newcomers, immigrants who haven't been here for a long time, that we are very, very serious about the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. And the way to do it, when Theo was killed, I said the most important thing to do now is to show submission everywhere so that the message gets through that we are not going to bow for intimidation and threats of murders and murderers. This is who we are. These are our values, and we want to fight for them. And it was the same thing with, go as far back as Salman Rushdie when he published his book. I think back then it should have been made not mandatory, but I think we should have had the courage to say, well, we don't burn books and we don't kill authors, and we are going to have this book available to anyone and everyone who wants to read it. And it's the same, I think, with what your minister is trying to achieve, is to get the message across to young children as young as possible to say, this is freedom of speech and here's why it matters and here is why we're fighting for it. So I'm completely with him. If then he, that minister and the administration, the government that he is in, are willing to protect the life and limb of those who are exposed to these pictures and also to those who are doing the exposing, because we don't want any more beheadings. So it is a situation that is very delicate, but I agree with the spirit behind it, the conviction that this is Denmark. We value freedom of speech, and these young children who are born to immigrants from different countries, there's only one way to do it, and that is to expose them not only to the pictures, but really to expose them to the idea of freedom of speech and why it is a fundamental building block of a liberal society.
I think we've just time for two questions, and then I think our time is just about up. We have one from an MC Passion, and I'll just rephrase the question slightly. I apologize if I haven't understood it correctly, but I think the question is it possible to separate the aspects of religious criticism and racism, because it seems like that every time you somehow try to criticize Islam as a religion, mm-hmm. it is portrayed as somehow being Islamophobic, as somehow being representative of a pathological state. But is there some way of getting back to the same situation as we have with Christianity, where no one would say that you're Christianity phobic if you somehow criticize Christianity, which people do all the time, mm-hmm. by the way?
Yes, absolutely. Because Islam is not a skin color. As you know, that there are 1.5 billion Muslims, and they have all sorts of different skin colors. Some of them are white, some of them are black, and some of them are all the shades of color that are in between. And many of them speak different languages. They come from different countries. So Islam is not a skin color. You can't use, if you say something about Islam that a Muslim person doesn't like, that's not Islamophobic. That's a criticism of an idea. Islam is a set of ideas, just like Christianity is a set of ideas. And so, as we talked about earlier in our conversation, Mikkel, the use of the term Islamophobia is really, it's an exploitation of the circumstances that Western countries find themselves in, where there were groups that were fighting for their own liberation, like homosexuals. So the word homophobia comes from denying homosexuals their rights. But we've all come to accept that homosexuality is a biological, immutable trait. Islam is not an immutable trait. It is, you either believe in those sets of ideas or you don't believe, or sometimes you believe a little bit, like some people do. And when you criticize Islam, for instance, the treatment of women in Islam, or the way homosexuals are treated, or the anti-Semitism driven by the Islamists, when you call these things out and you criticize them, you are not being racist. You are not being Islamophobic. So that Islamophobia word, it's a fallacy. If, and there are people exactly who do this, when they see somebody who looks like a Muslim, for instance, with a beard or with the headscarf, they behave in ways that are hostile to that person. I would not call that Islamophobia. It is bigotry, and you should call it what it is, but it is not Islamophobia, because you can't be phobic of an idea.
The last question for this evening, as it is in Denmark, I think it's noon where you are currently. But the last question is posed by Ms. Birgitte Kosovic, and she asked, "What do you think would be most likely to happen in the meeting or clash between the West and the Muslim minorities? I assume the immigrant communities over the next 10, 20 years?"
Good things can happen where the Muslim minorities are fully adapted and assimilated and integrated. And I think Denmark is on a good path towards that, because you're putting the necessary programs in place for that good outcome to happen. And bad outcomes are possible, as you can see now in parts of France, where whole neighborhoods are closed off, what their president calls separatist. And those separate neighborhoods, it's the associations, it's the schools, it's the businesses, everything now operates according to the rules of Sharia. And if that sort of thing grows, you are going to see more confrontations, more violence. You're going to see more populist parties and more far right-wing parties. And some people say, in fact, it can be as scary as what happened in the Balkans, which isn't so long ago. So it depends on what we do now and what we neglect to do for that outcome to happen. And I just wanted to say one more word about Islamophobia. It's the word phobia that gets me all the time. I don't think it is phobic to fear certain aspects of Islam, because we've seen people being beheaded. We've seen terrorist attack after terrorist attack. We've seen the establishment of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed, many of them beheaded, women taken as slaves. And all of these things are done with quotes, citations from the Holy Quran. And so to say that you are phobic is to deny that there's any kind of violence committed in the name of Islam. And I think the person who's asked the last question about what could things look like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that is what they could look like. You could see more and more violence in the name of Islam if we don't assimilate these minorities, and if we don't stop the separatism or the attempts at separating Muslim communities from the wider society.
Ms. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you very much for taking the time to join us this evening. It's been extremely enlightening and interesting to if not all the optimistic all the time, but it's been extremely interesting. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll just have a short few closing arguments in Danish, but thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and good luck.
Thank you very much. Og til jer seere, så vil jeg bare sige, at tusind tak for alle spørgsmål. Jeg er ked af, at vi ikke nåede alle sammen, men en time går jo hurtigt, når man er i et interessant selskab. Hvis I er interesseret i emnet, og det kunne jeg jo forestille mig, en del af dem, der ser med her i aften er, så har vi en lille minikonference her på søndag på Kontrast, også forbeholdt Kontrasts medlemmer med medvirken af Tina Magård, der skal tale om islamisk og islamisme i uddannelsessystemet og privat uddannelse blandt andet, og så kommer vi også til at tale med Charlotte Tavakoli, nu tror jeg fik udtalt det nogenlunde korrekt, som har skrevet bogen Islams offentlige hemmeligheder, der udkom for ikke så forfærdelig lang tid siden. Og der bliver også mulighed for at kunne stille spørgsmål i den anledning. Tusind tak, fordi I så med. Jeg håber, I fandt det lige så interessant, som jeg fandt det at afvikle det, og så ses vi jo forhåbentlig snart igen. Tak for i aften.